I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts, and welcome back to the Quilts for Baby and Beyond Sew Along. Today we are going to be making Tummy Time All-Star, and as you can see, this is a hexagon shaped quilt. I have two samples behind me, same feature fabrics, just one with a white print background, one with a black print background. So let's get started. Tummy Time All-Star was one of the first quilts that I designed for this book. I knew that I wanted something to be used for tummy time that would hold a child's interest. I decided on a rainbow of colorful diamonds arranged in the shape of a large star. I filled in the center and the outside with some background fabric. The background fabric can have some interest. This print is a Robert Kaufman Science Fair print that has some letters, numbers, hexagon shapes, and more. Another version I made has the same rainbow colors to make up the star, but a different Science Fair print on the outside. The rainbow colors pop off of the white, and there's a nice contrast with the subtle print of the Science Fair shapes. The third time I made this quilt was for my son William. I decided to use prints instead of solids in the rainbow of the star. I used mostly tone-on-tone prints from a variety of Tulip Pink collections from my stash. To add some interest, I used a white with pink accents for the background. Most recently, I've been making this quilt for my niece Ellie, who was born a few weeks ago. I decided to mix it up, and instead of doing a rainbow, I went with one print for the star fabric. This emphasizes the star shape of the design. I also decided to use two different background fabrics, the rainbow print in the center and a dinosaur print on the outside. If you've been following along, you know that this dinosaur print is the featured print of her nursery, and I've made sure to use it in each of her quilts. These are the fabrics I have selected to make Tummy Time All-Star today. I have decided to use fabrics that are from Tulip Pink's Daydreamer line. I've selected a rainbow of 18 prints. These prints are large and bold, so to offset them, I decided to use a solid in the background. That way, these will really be the star of the show, with this being the supporting character. One last thing to do after following all the cutting directions on page 49 is I highly suggest to trim off the sharp points of the diamonds and the triangles. By cutting off the sharp point and making it blunt like this, it will help significantly with construction. Let me show you how we do that. Here's what it looks like to trim the sharp points off of the diamonds. Go ahead and take your Super Sidekick ruler and have your piece pointed to the right if you're right-handed. Line up your solid line along the piece, the edge of your ruler along the other edge of your diamond, and trim. Then go ahead and rotate the piece around and repeat to trim the other corner. You can do multiple layers at a time, but I suggest doing one layer at a time until you're comfortable with the technique. If you're left-handed, this is what it'll look like. Set it up with your point to the left, take your ruler, solid line along the edge of the diamond, edge of the ruler here, and trim. So I'm going to repeat that for all of my diamonds. And then for our triangles, go ahead, very similar, point to the right if you're right-handed, and your triangle will already have one blunt corner from how you cut it off of your strip. So you're going to trim the other two. So point to the right, line up under the solid line, edge of the ruler, and this line should be under the solid line as well. Rotate to trim all of them off. And then if you're left-handed, this is what it'll look like. Go ahead, have your point to your left, take your ruler, line it up like this, and trim. What this will do is when you go ahead to piece two diamonds together, you're going to know exactly where to line them up because the blunt points as shown. If you don't do that, this is what it'll look like. You'll have a sharp point and a sharp point, and when you go to fold these together, you're not exactly sure how high up, how low, and you're going to have to eyeball that the valley to valley is 1/4 inch. If you're comfortable doing that, that's okay. But this is a surefire way to make sure that your pieces are going to line up correctly. In order to maintain the proper rainbow flow around the quilt, I find it extremely helpful to place my colored diamonds on a design wall in the full arrangement before sewing my blocks. That way I know exactly where everything is going to be and I don't accidentally mix them up and put them in a place that is not what I intended. So this is my first block and I just took it off my design wall. And I'm going to go ahead and begin to sew it together. And how we're going to sew this together is we're going to sew these two pieces and these two pieces. So our top two and our bottom two. And then we are going to sew these together to complete a diamond block. So we're going to take this piece and lay it on top of this piece. And we're going to sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam from there to there. And because of our notched corners, we know exactly where to line it up. And the same with our bottom. We have our final outside piece and then our background piece. I'm going to place those together. And so I'm over at my machine, ready to put together my first pieced block. And as I showed you at the cutting table, we're going to assemble it in rows and then put the rows together. Each one of the piece blocks will have 3 featured diamonds and 1 center background diamond. We're going to start by sewing 2 of the featured diamonds together. And if you have gone ahead and trimmed the sharp points off of your diamonds, you'll know exactly where to line it up. I don't pin at this stage since it's just 2 pieces, but if pinning helps you, especially if it helps you from mixing up your colors, please go ahead and do that. And I have my machine set to the same settings we've been using so far during the sew along, which is scant 1/4 inch seam, just 1 thread over from a 1/4 inch to account for the space that your thread will take up in your seam allowance. So we're just going to go ahead and sew, and I'm using Aurifil 2600. It's a medium gray that's going to blend in very well with my pieces. I'm just going to chain piece and sew my next pair together. Generally what I like to do is piece 1 block, make sure everything's turning out good, and then I'll go ahead and chain piece all of my blocks. So I'm just going to go ahead and take these off, and I'm going to head over to my iron and press these seams open so that I can sew this together. Sewn my first 2 seams, and now it is time to press them. I know it can be tempting to want to press in one direction so that you can nest like you would do with a 4-patch, but that's not something that we can do with this quilt. Because of the way that these intersect, when you go ahead and place them together to sew the next seam, one is this way, one is this way. They don't nest like they would with a 4-patch. So it really is best to press these open. Things will lay flat that way. So we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to start by finger pressing just to open them up. And then a heat resistant stiletto is very helpful so you don't burn your fingers. Silicone end can touch the iron. Simply going to press these open. And pressing is up and down with a little wiggle. This is ironing. When we push along something, we can stretch bias and distort things. We don't want to do that. So we want to go up and down with a little wiggle. We don't want to push. So now that I have those pressed, I'm going to head back on over to the machine. And I'm going to sew these together to complete my piece diamond block. And since I have my sharp points trimmed, I will know exactly where to line this up. And I will put a pin in here, here, and a pin in here as well to make sure that things don't move. I'm going to pin as mentioned, and my alignment point that I'm looking for is that my seam allowance point here is going to line up with my intersection here. So I'm going to match these up, raw edges together. And then I'm going to double check that that point lines up with that intersection. So I'm going to slide it over a little bit. Make sure I can't hold the pin and show you at the same time. All right, so we want to make sure that that point lines up with that. So we're going to slide them up and then put a pin in place. I'm going to flip it over and look at it from the other side, and the same should be true over here, which is this point should line up with that intersection, which it does. So now I'm going to simply pin the beginning and end of the seam, just to make sure nothing shifts around. Now I'm going to sew the length of this seam. A stiletto can come in handy here to make sure nothing shifts around. You want to make sure you remove your pins as you go and don't sew over your pins. So I'm going to use my stiletto to hold this intersection in place. Now that I have completed my pieced diamond, it's time to move on to my setting triangles. My setting triangles are going to begin with 2 half triangles. If you have solids, these are all look the same at this point. If they're prints, you should have an equal number of right and left. The right are cut with the ruler with the right side up. The left are cut with the ruler with the wrong side of the fabric up. You're going to match them up like this to create this shape. So they are going to be perfectly on top of each other, and just make sure if you are using prints that you have right sides together. And you are going to sew the short side of the half triangles. I'm going to repeat for a second one. I'm going to be doing 2 for each one of the blocks. I have my half triangle pairs sewn together to create my start of my setting pieces. And at this point, they both look the same. We're going to go ahead and open up our seam and press this seam open, just as we've been doing with everything else. And the next step is to create the setting blocks. And here is where we want to make sure that we are creating right setting blocks and left setting blocks. It can be easy to just get distracted and to start sewing everything in the same place and end up with all of our blocks looking like this. But we want half of our blocks like this and half of our blocks like this. And that's going to give us the correct orientation when we go to sew them in. This is basically a larger version of what we started with. So this would be the right setting blocks and this would be the left setting blocks. So we're simply going to take our triangles, and since we have cut our sharp points off, we know that this one is going to line up with this edge here, and this one is going to line up with the blunt edge of our half triangle down here, and then this one is going to flip this way onto here. Right now I'm going to go sew this pair. Eventually you're going to want to make 6 like this and 6 like this. I arranged these over at my pressing station, and I'm now simply going to sew on the triangle to complete my setting half triangle blocks. You want to make sure that you're sewing right and a left. These pieces should look different as you're putting them under the machine. And if you happen to make a mistake, you can always go ahead and take your stitches out and fix your block. Now that I have my setting half triangle blocks pieced, it's time to press these as well. Again, going to finger press. Use my heat resistant stiletto to keep everything open. The next step is to sew these to my diamond to finish creating my first of my 6 blocks. When arranging these, you want to make sure that you have your background diamond away from here. If you set it up like this, it's a different quilt, also a pretty quilt, but a different quilt. So you make sure you set it up with your background away from these. And most of the quilts that we have done with 6 blocks like this that I call pizza slices, they are triangular. And this one is not. This one is going to end with 4 sides. It's not a diamond in this shape, but it's a different type of diamond. So just be aware it does look different, and that is on purpose. So you're going to arrange these so that you have your straight side that is your straight of grain of your pieces and your right angle to the outside. If you get distracted, you can easily do it like this because the length of the side is the same, and then you are going to end up with a rectangle over here and a point, and your 6 pieces are not going to go together. So you want to make sure that you have these arranged properly. The diagram in the pattern can help as well. And then we are going to sew these in place. I suggest starting with the right. So we're going to take this and flip it on here, and we are going to line up our blunt corners with our blunt corners and sew our 1/4 inch seam, and then we'll press and then add this one in the same manner. Over at my machine, and I'm ready to sew the seam. And one thing I want to mention before I start this is that I did change my thread. I'm now using 2730. It's a purplish blue that is going to better match my background fabric. Since I will be sewing lots of pieces together that are the same color, if you kind of pull at them, if they are a lighter colored thread, you would see that, and I don't want that. So I am going to use a matching thread for this. If you have a darker background similar to this, I suggest doing that as well. So I'm simply going to sew this, and since there are no points to match up because this is all the same fabric, I'm not going to pin this in advance. It is a medium length seam, so if pinning it is helpful for you, go ahead and do that. I'm simply going to match up the ends here and hold them in place with my hand as I guide the beginning part through. Slow down when I get to the middle here. Use my stiletto to ease that bulk underneath. And again, I'm just holding this with my finger down here. I'm going to go ahead and press this open. Now when it comes to lining up this next piece, I'm going to give you a little bit of advice here. This point's pretty easy to line up. I'm going to line that up there. This does match up here, but it's not so important since this is all one color. Up here, here's what we've got going on. Is this raw edge is going to go to here, and then the edge of this is going to line up with the edge of where I sewed, and you are going to have a small little triangle of this blue popped out. That is the equivalent of this piece here as well. So don't be surprised when you have that. Don't try and stretch it to make sure you're covering that. That's not what you want. You want to line up this piece with the seam, the edge there. I'm going to begin my seam by lining up my blunt point with the edge of my diamond here. Slowly sew till I get to the middle. Use my stiletto to hold the bulk down. And again here, what I'm looking for is that this blunt edge lines up with my pink here. I'm not worried about that tiny little triangle. And I'm not going to worry about backstitching here because I will be adding borders, and that extra thread can just sometimes muddy up my seam. I'm going to go ahead, press this, and then repeat the same steps to go ahead and make all 6 of my pieced blocks. I have completed sewing all 6 of my pizza slices and put them back above my design wall. This way I can ensure that the color flow that I originally intended is in place. If you happen to have mixed something up, this is where you could figure that out and take the time to go ahead and correct that. Make sure you have your blocks exactly how you want them. Then the next step is to begin to sew them together to complete the center of the quilt top. We're going to start with the top left block and the top center block. We're going to pin these together and sew this seam. And then once we have that together, we are going to pin the top right to that to complete the top half. And then we'll repeat those steps with the bottom. So I'm going to take these 2, place them right sides together, and head on over to the machine. I'm over at my machine, and I have these 2, and I want to go ahead and pin in place where my diamond matches so that I keep those seams nice and accurate. So I'm going to simply peel this one back like this to double check that it's in the right place. And once I have it in the right place, go ahead and place a pin on either side. Recently, someone in the group mentioned fork pins are really helpful for this. I have not personally used them, but I've heard some good things. So if you have those or want to try them out, that could be a good idea as well. So I'm going to do the same with this intersection. And lastly, I'm just going to place a pin at the beginning and the end. Now, when it comes to thread color, you have some choices here. If you have a light color or neutral background, you could go ahead and use that thread. If you have a darker background, like what I used here today, what I've decided to do is I am using the blue thread in my machine that matches this. I would rather it possibly show here than show in the larger areas. Personal choice. Another option takes a little bit more time, but you could go ahead, sew here, switch to a lighter thread, switch back to the darker thread. Again, personal choice, so go ahead and do what works best for you. So I have my machine set up with my darker thread, and I'm not going to backstitch here because we will be adding a border. So I'm simply just going to sew the same seam we've been doing to assemble the blocks and sew the length of this seam. Slow down when I get to intersections. Make sure that I don't sew over my pins. If they go past where your needle is, you can wait to remove them. Otherwise, you want to take them out before you sew. You never want your needle and your pins to intersect. Use a stiletto if needed to keep things in place. I have my first two pieces together. And I could head on over to the iron right now to press this entire seam open, or what I'm going to do so that I can stay here and just add my third pizza slice is I'm just going to simply press the center open. That's the only part that's going to intersect with my next piece. I'm going to take my seam roller, just give that a little bit of a roll, and that there now is flat enough that I can go ahead and add my third piece, and then I can worry about pressing everything once I have the top half of my quilt complete. I have my first two complete, and this part that I finger pressed here. So I'm going to take my next piece from the top right, place it on top, head back on over to the machine and pin this in place. I'm going to pin these in the same manner. And now I'm going to sew the length of this seam. I have the top half of my quilt complete, and I pressed it, so I'm going to bring it on back over to my design wall. Get those fuzzies off. There we go. So now I'm going to repeat the same steps I used to put these three together with my bottom three. So I'm going to start with my bottom left, my bottom middle, sew these together, and then add this piece. I've completed the bottom half of my quilt, pressed it, and added it back to my design wall. You may be thinking at this point it's best to do the hang pin, which I've shown you a couple times during our sew along. If you have a featured print in the middle, that would be a great idea. If you have used one background like I did, you don't really need to worry about it. I would pin here, but it's not as essential that all 6 of those points perfectly match up because that's not where your eye is going to go. It's going to all blend together. Make sure that you're going to pin here, 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 and here because that's where your eye is naturally going to go. So I'm going to place these two right sides together and head on over to the machine. Just like when I placed 2 of my pizza slices together, I'm going to go ahead and pin these intersections with 2 pins, one on either side of the intersection. I am going to pin this center intersection, but I'm just not going to take the time to do the hang pin since that's a longer technique. But if you have prints here that need that, I have linked below to when I showed the hang pin earlier during the sew along. Lastly, I'm going to pin at the beginning and the end, and then slowly going to sew the length of this seam. After finishing sewing my center seam, I went ahead and pressed it. Now I have the center of my quilt top complete, and I'm ready to go and begin and add my borders. Border pieces are cut following the directions on page 49, and there are 6 of them to cut to each of 3 different lengths. The information's there on page 49, and the assembly directions begin at the top of page 51. So we're going to start with, this is the right side of my quilt, and we're going to begin with the right and left sides, sewing on our shortest 2 pieces, and simply going to place that right sides together and sew. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from this side so that I make sure I don't lose any of my points when I get to the machine, and it's easier to make sure that I don't flip any of these seams. I'm not going to pin this. I'm just going to head on over to the machine, holding this in place, and sew this seam. I'm over at my machine, and as I showed, I have my border piece to my side piece, and I'm going to go ahead and now flip this so that I have my quilt facing up. And I have just centered this piece approximately in the middle there. It doesn't need to be exact as long as it's not too short at either end. You want to make sure you have a little bit of overhang. And since this is my first border piece and this will get encompassed by other border pieces, I'm not going to backstitch this one. I'm simply going to go underneath, use my stiletto to make sure that I sew right to the edge of that point and I don't accidentally sew that point off. Now nice and slow, just going to sew the length of this seam. Nice and slow as I reach the end here. Again, making sure that I don't lose that point. I finished sewing this piece and I'm now going to sew the second border piece on the opposite side of my quilt. Again, using the shortest of the 3 pieces. Just like I did with the first one, I'm going to flip it upside down so that I'm sewing with my quilt on top. I know this doesn't feel very natural. We usually sew with the smaller item on top of the larger item, but this way we can make sure that we don't lose our points that we worked so hard on. I'm going to start nice and slow, use my stiletto, and again, slowly sew the length of this seam. After sewing on the first 2 border pieces, it's time to press. Up until now, I've suggested pressing your seams open. At this point, I would suggest pressing out to the border. We have bulk in here and no bulk in our border. Simply going to press it. I'm pushing a little bit towards the border, but not too much. I want to make sure that I don't inadvertently stretch anything. So again, pressing is more up and down. Don't want to push too much. After sewing on the borders, it's time to go ahead and trim the excess before we can sew on the next border. We're going to do this using our Super Sidekick ruler. The angle we're looking for here is 120 degrees, which is exactly what our ruler is as well. So we're going to use the edge of our ruler along the first border piece that we did, and we're going to use the bottom of our ruler along the edge over here. We want to make sure that our point ends up under the dotted line so that we have a 1/4 inch seam here and we don't trim off our point. And sometimes things have gotten off a little bit, and if that happens, you just kind of best approximate this angle and trim. And if you are left-handed, this is what that's going to look like. Going to line up your ruler like this and like this and trim. Since I'm right-handed, I'm going to continue to trim that way. After you have completed your trimming, it's time to add the next border pieces. So you have 2 medium length border pieces, and those are going to be added counterclockwise up here and on the opposite side. Same as the first 2, head on over to the machine, place these right sides together. So from this side, scant 1/4 inch seam. I've now sewn on my second set of borders, borders number 3 and 4. I should mention that at the machine you can backstitch here, as this is now going to be the outside of the quilt. I'm now going to trim that piece off, and trim here as well so that I can add the final borders 5 and 6. Teresa Silva of Quilting is My Bliss quilted all of the Tummy Time All-Star quilts that I've made. For the Tummy Time quilt featured on the cover of Quilts4BB and Beyond, Teresa custom quilted a 6-pointed star that joins the inner points of the rainbow star. Then she filled in the remaining inner star background with ribbon candy bordered by point-to-point quilting. Each of the rainbow diamonds has echo quilted borders, which are again filled in with ribbon candy quilting. The outer background is filled in with an abundance of swirls. This one with the white background and rainbow star is very unique and custom designed. There's stars quilted within the rainbow star that are filled in with swirls and plumes. Each of the rainbow diamonds has echo quilted borders filled in with serpentines. There's a border quilted on the outside of the rainbow star. In it, there are diamonds quilted in the shadows, as well as the remaining outer background is filled in with densely quilted plumes. My other Tummy Time quilts were edge-to-edge quilted. Our son William's quilt was quilted with the Dizzy Izzy Panto. This design reminds me of a tray of cinnamon rolls nestled together. Teresa Silva also quilted my most recent finish for me. This Tummy Time All-Star quilt for my niece Ellie, she did with a pantograph design called Seafoam. It has big swirls with some pebbles. Binding a hexagon-shaped quilt is very similar to binding a square with a few differences. Since I just got this quilt back, I'm going to head on over to the machine and show you how I bind a hexagon. My first step was that I decided to add a label. I get these woven labels from Dutch Label Company, and that's what they look like on the inside if you've never seen, depending on the colors and whatnot that you use. And I like to put them into the binding if I have not pieced a label into the backing, so that the person, the gift recipient, knows who made it. So I just basted that on with an 1/8 inch seam onto the back of my quilt. So now I have my binding, and you may recognize this. I have used this pink on a few of the projects for Ellie. So I made a lot of bias binding following the directions in the beginning of the book early on in the beginning of the sew along, and I think I have just enough left to do this quilt here today. So we're going to start similar to how we do for a square or a rectangle, which is leave about a 6 to 8 inch tail, and gonna go under, and I am using the same 1/4 inch settings that I used for the rest of the journey so far during the sew along, and I am using the 2600 neutral gray because it kind of blends in with this white busy background as well as the binding. So I suggest you use thread that matches your binding or your quilt, depending on what the color differences are. And it's best, when possible, to make your seams not land on a corner. So you see this seam here finishes before I get to this corner. That's not always possible, but it's nice to not have to deal with that bulk in the corner. So I'm going to go ahead and sew. Okay, and I'm going to stop a couple inches away from the corner. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to move my excess binding out of the way, and I'm going to lay my binding out where it is going to be going. And then I'm going to take my Sidekick or Super Sidekick ruler and lay it on top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the ruler with the edge of my quilt here, and my point goes right to the edge. I'll move the binding out of the way so you can see that. And I'm simply going to take a pencil and make a light line right there. Make it a little darker so that you can see it. You don't need to be this dark. I'm doing this because we're recording, but just dark enough that you can see it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to continue to sew until we get to that line. And what that's going to do is that's going to help us know where to stop our miter, because then we're going to backstitch a little bit, take it out, fold it away, and continue. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to stitch right up until that drawn line, and now I'm going to backstitch I'm going to remove my piece and I'm going to fold my binding away. And normally with a square quilt, we fold it to a 90 degree and a 90 degree. What we want to do with a 60 degree hexagon or any other angle that is greater than a 90 is we want to go away from where we're going. So we want this to be a perfectly straight line here. So fold this up here, and my fold, if I kind of finger press, happens to be on the line that I drew. That's another double check to yourself. And then fold it back onto itself right at the point. So it is a smaller miter than you're probably used to with a 90. There's not a lot of fabric here, and that is correct. That is all you should have there. And then you can either pin this in place, clip this in place, or just hold it in place. I'm going to put a pin in so nothing shifts. And then I'll show you what it looks like. So that is what it looks like. I've got my miter right on my line, and then it goes right to my corner there, and then I'm going to continue. And I'm going to repeat this process in each of the 6 corners. I often get asked when I teach how I get my binding on so accurately and have such nice crisp corners. And my answer always has to do with it's how you sew it on by machine. There's nothing you can do in the wrapping later on to fix what happened with the machine. So taking your time and having patience when you sew it on by machine is what's going to give you successful corners later on when you wrap the binding around. So I'm just simply going to do this straight side and then get to the corner and miter it again. I tried to make it so that I wouldn't have any of my seams at corners, but inevitably sometimes you just can't avoid that. Luckily here it's going to kind of be split between the very beginning and the very end, and there's not much at the corner itself. But if you find that you end up right at the corner and it's way too much bulk, another tip is you can take this out, undo a few stitches, and make this seam sooner in your binding, make it over here. So that you can move that away from the corner. And you can only do that if you have enough extra. So make sure that you do that, that you double check that you have plenty of extra before you do that. But I have done that before if the seam ends up right at the edge, because having a seam at the edge is one thing that will take away from having a perfect corner. It is very hard to have a perfect corner if you have all that extra bulk. I've now made it back to where I started, so I'm going to take it off and show you how I'm going to match these up to make seamless binding all the way around the quilt. So take my project off of my machine, and I'm going to put it in front of me. I'm going to take my starting end and place that out of the way, and I'm going to take my ending piece and I'm going to lay that first. I'm going to lay it so that my raw edges of my binding match my raw edges of my quilt. And then I'm going to open up my binding since I have double fold binding. And I'm going to put my beginning tail on top of my ending tail. So this is what it's going to look like. Then I'm going to take my pencil and mark this line. And now I need to add a 1/2 inch to this to account for the seam allowance when sewing these two pieces together. So I'm going to just take a small ruler and add a 1/2 inch. Now I can either cut this with scissors or rotary cutter. I find scissors often is a better choice at this stage. Instead of risking accidentally cutting into your quilt, having a rotary cutter so near a finished quilt. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim that off. Now I have these two ends and I need to pin them. You want to make sure when you go to pin them that you're not accidentally twisting anything. It's easiest to bunch the quilt up like this to give yourself that little bit of extra that you need. Open them both up like this and put them right sides together. And I find it helpful to pin in place so nothing slides around. And we're going to offset them so that the 1/4 inch is where this valley is, and same on the other side. So you want to account for the seam allowance. So that's what it looks like on the other side. Slide my quilt out of the way. And sew these two ends together. Make sure to remove my pins as I go. When I make my binding, I do press this seam over at my iron, but I'm not going to turn my iron on just for this small section. So I'm just going to finger press, and if I needed to, I could also grab my seam roller and then press it like this, give it a little roll, and then I'm going to trim these dog ears off. You can do this before or after you sew it on. And now when I open up my project, it should perfectly lay flat, which it does. And so now I just need to sew this last piece on. And I'll continue about an inch or so past just to make sure it's on there nice and strong. The next step is to wrap the binding around to the back and clip in place, and then you can either hand sew or machine sew. I do love hand sewing, but with baby quilts, I know that they're often going to get used a lot and washed a lot. This quilt in particular, being designed as a tummy time mat, is most likely going to get spit up on and all kinds of things. So for durability purposes, I am going to bind the last part by machine. As beautiful as hand binding is, it is not as strong over time. And for something like this that I know is going to get washed a lot, I know that it's best to just go ahead and do machine binding. And I'll show you how we're going to miter those corners. So I just go ahead and clip a couple inches of either two sides on the way to a corner. Put a couple more in. Okay. Now that I have these two sides clipped mostly up to the corner, what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it over and I'm just going to give it a light tug just to make that nice and crisp. I'm just going to give that a light tug. Now, the big secret here, first I'm going to trim any loose threads, but then the big secret here is what I call split the bulk. And split the bulk is going to make it so that things lay as flat as possible. If you can tell, the miter in the front is over here, so that's the bulk. So if we did this side first and then this side, all of our bulk is here on the left. That's not splitting the bulk, and it makes for a clunky corner. So we want to wrap this side first where the bulk is, and then this side, because what that's going to do is that's going to split the bulk. So this is going to lay flatter if you put it between your fingers. So the first side is easy. Wrap the first side and clip that in place. The second side, normally we tuck this all the way with a 90, but if you tuck that all the way, that's what you're going to end up with. And you're going to have this weird little triangle area missing. Just like how we only had a small amount of fabric mitered on the front when we put the binding on, we only want that same small amount of fabric on the back. So not a full tuck like that, just a slight little bit till those two match up right there, and clip. Double check that it looks good on the front, which it does. And then I'm going to repeat that process with all 6 corners. Once you have the binding all sewn on and clipped, it's time to go ahead and do the stitching. And I'm going to go ahead and do that by machine. And so I'm going to start on a leader ender to make sure that I don't get a thread's nest. I have my 1/4 inch foot on with my needle slid over just a couple of notches. You know your machine best to know if you should be using a walking foot at this point, an open foot, so forth and so on. I am not a machine expert, so I am going to just tell you what I do with my machine. I do a couple back stitches, and then I'm just simply going to stitch. I'm stitching on the quilt, not on the binding, but right at the edge as if there was a ditch, and I'm making sure to catch the back. And since this stitching will be seen on the quilt top and on the binding, I suggest having thread that will match accordingly. As much as we try and be perfect, your chances are you're going to sew onto the binding at some point or sew further into the quilt, and you don't want it to be so visible. And as you're going, just nice and slow and steady. And I wait to take this clip out till the last possible moment because it is what is holding my nice perfect miter in place. I'm simply going to get to the corner, leave my needle down, and then pivot. I'll show you what it looks like on the back. So this is what it looks like on the back, and I will occasionally check as I'm going to make sure that I've caught this, and if I've missed any part, I'll stop and go back and make sure that I catch that in. And that's how I'm going to finish binding this quilt. Thanks for joining me here today. I hope you have enjoyed making your Tummy Time All-Star quilt. I would love to see it. Please post it and use the hashtag #JBirdBaby so that I can see it. It has been a pleasure over the last few weeks to do the Quilts for Baby and Beyond sew along with you. I have enjoyed teaching you how to do some of the quilts and pillows from the book. I hope you'll join us for our future sew-alongs. Please stay tuned to our email newsletter and our social channels for the next announcement. If you've enjoyed this video today, please be sure to like it, subscribe, and share your comments with us. Thanks so much.